The one financial mistake every generation repeats is not overspending in some obvious, cartoonish way. It is mistaking the signal of wealth for the substance of wealth. That is the real trap. Every generation believes it has outgrown the mistakes of the one before it. The symbols change, the language changes, the moral justification changes, but underneath the costume, the same structural error keeps returning. People absorb an idea of what doing well is supposed to look like, and then they spend years building the appearance of a rival before they have actually built the engine that could support it. That is why the mistake survives. It never feels reckless from the inside. It feels normal. It feels deserved. It feels like progress. So let me give you the one mother line that everything in this story serves. Each generation gets trapped when it spends too early on the version of success its era glorifies, instead of building the assets that would make that success real. That is the line. Not stupidity, not bad character, not a lack of effort. Signal before substance, because once you the whole pattern becomes visible. The boomer does it through the house. Gen X does it through the upgraded lifestyle. Millennials do it through experiences. Gen Z does it through the visible aesthetic of financial awareness. The props keep changing, the mistake does not. Money gets directed toward the costume before the balance sheet is strong enough to carry the role. That is the repeating failure. Now let me show you the mechanisms. The first mechanism is arrival theater. People rarely build toward an abstract future. They build toward a picture. That picture is usually inherited, a certain home, a certain car, a certain kind of travel, a certain kind of visible taste, a certain kind of life that says, without needing to say it directly, I made it. That is arrival theater. The problem is not that people want a beautiful life. The problem is timing. If you buy the symbols too early, the symbol begins consuming the asset base that was supposed to fund it. The theater becomes more expensive than the structure behind the curtain. The audience may be impressed. The owner of the life remains financially more fragile than the stage design suggests. This is why I say the mistake repeats even among careful people. Most people caught in it are not reckless. They often budget. They often work hard. They often think they are being sensible. The trap is subtler than that. It tells you that because the symbol is culturally accepted as a sign of progress, building the symbol must be the same thing as building progress itself. It is not. A symbol can be financed long before the underlying freedom exists. That is what makes it a trap. Now let us move to the second mechanism. I call it single asset comfort. This is the boomer version of the trap, but it still matters far beyond that generation. For many people who came of age in the post-war dream, owning a home was not just one good financial move. It became the whole emotional definition of success. The house was stability. The house was adulthood. The house was evidence that life had landed where it was supposed to land. That belief made sense in its time. It also became dangerous. That is single asset comfort. A house can absolutely be a wonderful asset. It becomes a trap when it is mistaken for a complete plan. If most of your net worth is trapped inside the place you live, and if your retirement security, flexibility, and cash flow resilience were underbuilt because maintaining the house absorbed decades of attention and money, then the home did not solve the problem. It merely made the wealth signal visible while leaving major weaknesses hidden. On paper, you look secure. In practice, you may be asset rich, income light, and psychologically unable to unlock the very equity everyone assumes makes you safe. That is why this mechanism is so powerful. People see appreciation and think plan fulfilled. But appreciation without liquidity, diversification, or enough other invested capital can leave a person surprisingly cornered later in life. The house was not the mistake. Treating the house as the whole answer was. That is single asset comfort. Now let us move to the third mechanism. I call it lifestyle drift. This is the Gen X version. but again the pattern reaches much wider. Lifestyle drift does not happen through one dramatic binge. It happens through 100 reasonable upgrades. A raise comes in, the car gets better, the home gets bigger, the school gets nicer, the holiday gets farther, the subscriptions multiply, the standard of normal rises, every step feels justified. That is what makes the trap so elegant. Lifestyle drift is dangerous because it lets income growth hide the absence of wealth growth. From the outside, everything looks like progress, and in one sense, it is life may genuinely become more comfortable. But if spending expands as fast as income, the actual investable gap, the part of life that becomes future freedom, barely grows at all. The person earns more and still arrives at middle age with less room than the headline salary would imply. That is how impressive income creates underwhelming security. The structure has improved cosmetically, not strategically. This is one of the most common financial misunderstandings in modern life. People think higher income automatically means they are getting ahead. Sometimes it only means they are getting more expensive. That is lifestyle drift. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call it experience substitution. This is the millennial version of the trap, when asset ownership gets farther away, and when the old signals of arrival, house, pension, low-cost stability feel inaccessible or absurdly delayed, people do not stop seeking a reward for their effort. They redirect it. They spend on what is still available: travel, restaurants, concerts, weekends away, convenience, memories, a life that feels lived, even if the asset side of the balance sheet is not moving much. That is experience substitution. And I want to be very clear, the experiences are not the enemy. A life made only of grim restraint is not wisdom. The trap appears when experiences become a psychological substitute for building, when they become the way you soothe the discomfort of not being able to access the older versions of wealth, and when culture tells you this is actually the more enlightened path. The spending becomes emotionally protected. It no longer feels like a trade-off. It feels like philosophy. That is why this mechanism is so effective. The person tells themselves they are choosing life over materialism. In reality, they may be consuming the exact capital that would have begun building the future freedom. They still quietly want. The memory becomes beautiful. The account remains thin. The anxiety returns. A new trip gets booked. That is experience substitution. Now, I call it aesthetic finance. This is the Gen Z version of the same old mistake. Gen Z is far more financially literate than many people give it credit for. Index funds, ISAs, Roths, compounding, side hustles, market content. All of this is much more culturally visible early. That is real progress. But every generation finds a new way to perform wealth before securing it. That is aesthetic finance. The apartment looks curated, the setup looks premium, the outfit, the skincare, the coffee gear, the desk, the subscriptions, the visible taste, all of it creates the appearance not only of style but of control. Add a small monthly investment and a few correctly used phrases, and a person can look financially evolved long before the balance sheet is doing anything proportionate underneath. This is not ignorance. It is performance pressure. When wealth becomes social content, the temptation is no longer only to spend for pleasure. It is to spend for coherence. The life has to look like someone who understands money. The irony is brutal. The generation most aware of investing can still underbuild actual wealth if too much money gets directed toward the visual language of being on top of things rather than the unphotogenic work of letting assets accumulate quietly. That is aesthetic finance. Now let us move to the sixth mechanism. I call it delayed costume. This is the rule that helps people escape the trap. Delayed costume means refusing to buy the look of success faster than you are building the structure of success. It does not mean never enjoying life. It means sequencing matters. The older car for a few more years, the smaller home for a bit longer, fewer trips, less visible upgrading, more automatic investing, more broad asset accumulation, more actual ownership before the theater budget gets expanded. This is the move every generation that escaped the trap eventually understood. Not no lifestyle, delayed lifestyle. Not no pleasure, pleasure after the asset base begins doing real work. This is psychologically difficult because humans are social creatures. We want to look aligned with the story our environment celebrates. Delayed costume asks you to tolerate a gap between what you could appear to be and what you are choosing to build first. That can feel socially hot. It can feel like restraint in a world of visible acceleration. It can feel like you are behind even while you are actually getting ahead. That is why so few people do it. But the ones who do end up with something the costume cannot fake. Substance, that is delayed costume. Now let us move to the seventh mechanism. I call it asset priority. This is the clean answer to the repeating mistake. Assets first, lifestyle second. That principle is simple enough to sound obvious and difficult enough to change almost everything. Asset priority means every raise, every surplus, every good season, every avoided expense, and every strategic sacrifice gets interpreted through one main question. Does this move increase the engine that will make future freedom easier, or does it mostly increase the signal that I am already there? That question is ruthless. It is also clarifying. If a person follows asset priority consistently, the generational costume stops dominating. The boomer still owns a home, but not as the whole plan. The Gen Xer still enjoys life, but income rises faster than lifestyle. The millennial still takes trips, but experiences do not consume the asset building years. The Gen Zer still has taste, but the actual account grows faster than the aesthetic of having an account. That is what escape looks like. Not rejecting your generation completely, refusing to let its preferred signal outrun your balance sheet. Now, I want to force the identity shift because without it, this still sounds like generational commentary instead of a real operating philosophy. Stop thinking like someone trying to look on track. Start thinking like a signal skeptic. A person trying to look on track asks what success is supposed to look like at my age. A signal skeptic asks whether the thing being celebrated is actually building freedom or merely performing it. A person trying to look on track follows the generation's costume. A signal skeptic delays the costume until the assets can carry it. A person trying to look on track wants social confirmation. A signal skeptic wants structural security. That is the stronger identity. Because once you think that way, the trap gets easier to spot in real time. The house that becomes the whole plan. The lifestyle that expands with every raise. The experience habit that replaces asset building. The aesthetic that performs wealth. They are all just versions of the same ancient human error, buying the symbol before the machine exists. And now let me give you the operating system plainly. First, identify your generation's preferred signal of arrival. Name it directly, so it cannot hide inside normality. Second, ask whether that signal is currently supported by assets or merely financed by hope, debt, or future earnings. Third, stop treating socially praised spending as proof of real progress. Many admired moves are still structurally weak moves. Fourth, build assets before you build the costume. Delay visible upgrades longer than your instincts want to. Fifth, let raises widen your investable gap before they widen your lifestyle. Sixth, enjoy life on purpose, but do not let experiences replace ownership. Seventh, remember that the goal is not to look arrived, it is to actually arrive. That is the heart of it. Every generation repeats the same mistake because every generation gets handed a different version of the same lie. that the symbol of success is close enough to success itself. It never is. Now let me end where this really matters. You can keep following the script your era gave you. The upgrades, the trips, or the aesthetic are close enough to wealth that the distinction hardly matters. You can keep building a life that feels socially complete, while the financial engine underneath stays thinner than it should be. Or you can do the harder thing. You can delay the costume, you can fund the engine, you can protect the gap, you can let the people around you think you are moving slower while the asset base quietly moves faster. And you can make sure your version of arrival is not just something other people can see, but something your future can actually survive on. That is the threshold. Because the one financial mistake every generation repeats is not really about money. It is about mistaking admiration for security. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. If the version of success you are currently financing vanished tomorrow, would the assets underneath it still be strong enough to call you wealthy? That question will tell you which side of the trap you are standing on.